I think the textbook does a pretty decent job of explaining a lot of things, but I want to give you maybe a different perspective about creating programs with functions. So to start, let's pick one of the programming challenges from the book. In particular, I'm looking at number 4 at the end of chapter 6. Here's what it says. I'll give you just a minute to read through it, and then let's talk about it. First of all, we're dealing with 5 regions in a city: north, south, east, west, and central. We're trying to find out which one had the fewest automobile accidents last year. The textbook wants us to write a program with 2 functions, but we're going to modify that just a bit. The first function is going to return an integer. Its name is getNumAccidents, and here are the specs. It has 1 argument, which is the name of a region, so we'll make that a string. It's going to ask the user for the number of accidents in that region. That means this is an input function. As part of the function, it's going to validate the input, meaning we're not going to accept a number less than 0. Once the user enters a valid number of accidents, the function's going to return that integer. Last, we're told that this function should be called once for each city region. Now make sure you realize that we're writing 1 function that's going to be called 5 times. That's one of the beauties of writing a function. You can use that same function more than once in a program. The second function is described as a void function in the text, but we're going to make it return an integer. We'll be sending this function 5 arguments, 1 integer for each of the regions. Then the function will decide which is the smallest value and return that number. The textbook wants this function to do 2 different things, namely decide the smallest and then to print that out. But a function should really only do 1 job. So we're going to create an output function to display the results of the program. Here's a hierarchy chart to view what the program would look like in terms of functions. Notice that the main function will call the others. What does main need to know in terms of data? Well, it's going to need the variables for the north, south, east, west, and central regions, but it's also going to need a variable that will represent the fewest number of accidents. The main function will call the other 3. Let's look at our input function first. Main will send 1 argument to that function, which is a string that has the name of the region in it. But what will that function send back to main? And the answer is the number of accidents entered by the user. Notice that this function receives data and also returns data to main. The main function will call the find lowest function next. For that function to do its job, main has to send 5 arguments to it. That is, 1 integer for each of the 5 regions. Then the find lowest function will return 1 piece of data to main, an integer that represents the fewest number of accidents. Finally, the main function will call an output function named displayResults. Now remember, this is different from what the book wanted us to do, but this is a better way to do it. That function needs 6 arguments sent to it. The 5 integers representing the regions, and also a 6th integer that represents the fewest number of accidents. Now this output function is not going to return any data to main. Its job is simply to display the results on the screen. Okay, we've looked at the hierarchy chart. Let's translate that into a program. I'll start the program with the usual heading, the normal includes, and the using namespace statement. Then come my function prototypes. The first function is going to receive a string and return an integer. The next function will receive 5 integers and return 1 integer that represents the fewest number of accidents. And the third function, as we've seen before in our chart, will receive 6 parameters, and it's not going to return anything. Now inside the main function, the first thing I'll do is to declare the variables that main has to have to do its job. Now main is just a function also, but it's a very important one. So how do we go about getting a value for our north variable? The answer is we call our input function. Notice something about the function call. The parameter does not have to be a variable. Here I'm using a literal string, north. The getNumberOfAccidents function will ask the user for a number and then return that number, and the number it sends back will be stored in the north variable. Make sure you realize what's going on here. It's worth repeating. The program calls the getNumberOfAccidents function, sends it a string indicating the north region, and then the function returns an integer that gets stored in the north variable. We'll do something similar to get a value for the south variable. I'm calling the same function that I did before, but now I'm sending it a string that has the word south in it. So when the function returns an integer, the user will have been asked for the number of accidents in the south region, and that value will get stored in the south variable. In the next 3 lines, I'll do similar things with the other regions. That's going to complete our input. Then the main function will call the findLowest function, and it'll send it the 5 variables that we just got values for. That function will compute the smallest of those parameters and return that value. Notice that the value gets stored in our last variable, lowest. Then on line 28, the main function will call our output function and send it the 6 arguments that we talked about before. That's the end of our main function. Notice that I'd like for you to write it first because it lays out your whole program for you in a sort of overview. Now we need to write the individual functions. Let's start with a function that gets the number of accidents for each region. I know I need an integer to hold the user's input, so I'll declare accidents as a variable. I also know that I have to validate the user's input, and for that I'll use a do-while loop. Inside the loop, I'll ask for the number of accidents and let the user enter their value. But that loop has to keep going as long as the user is entering negative numbers. Whenever the user enters a value that is 0 or larger, the loop will stop. At that point, the function returns the user's value. As part of good documentation, and also as part of the general format rules, each function should have a heading. Look at the parts of this heading for our input function. We write the name of the function, what parameter the function receives, and then a brief description of what the function does. Then we indicate what the function returns to whoever called it, main in this case, and that integer represents the number of accidents for that region. A precondition is an assumption made by a function. Ask yourself this: does this function have to assume anything about its string parameter? No, not really. So we indicate there are no preconditions. Our next function gets 5 integers representing the regions. Now this is a good place to use the king of the mountain algorithm to find the smallest value. If you'll remember, in that algorithm, the first value in line is the original king. So we set our smallest variable equal to the north value. Remember, the first one there is the first king. Next, we check to see if the south variable is smaller than the king. If so, the king gets replaced by the south variable on the next line. Now here we're using the smallest variable as king, so king doesn't always have to mean the largest. It doesn't in this case. Then we check to see if the east value beats the current king, and if so, the king gets replaced. We work our way through the other parameters, and by the time we get through with all of our if statements, our variable named smallest will contain the lowest value among those parameters, and that's what the function returns. So let's document this function like we did before. Our last function, the displayResults function, checks each one of its parameters to see if it matches the lowest parameter. If so, that region and its number of accidents gets printed out. Because of the if-else-if structure, this program assumes that there's only one region with the lowest number of accidents. If that were not the case, we'd have to change up our logic in the output function. And then we'll document it like we did the others. Then I'll run the program to make sure it works. And it does with this set of numbers, but to really test it, I should run it enough times that each region would have the fewest number of accidents. There you have it. This is the way I'd like for you to write programs by using functions. Each function has one job to do. That makes debugging your program a whole lot easier, and it's also easier for another programmer to know what the heck is going on in each part. Another thing, if I wanted to change, say, the output function, that wouldn't have any effect on any other function in the program. As much as possible, you want your functions to be independent from each other. Please get with me if this doesn't make sense or if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.